So now, Professor José Reinaldo Lopes, whom I again thank for his kindness in being here with us, will comment on the paper, and then we're going to have good time for debating, for trying ideas, for talking to all speakers and everything. Thank you.
Obrigado, bom dia a todos. Eu começo naturalmente agradecendo o convite que me foi feito pelo professor Garcês de compartilhar esta manhã, esta mesa e comentar o trabalho do professor Marotti. E agradeço sempre com uma dúvida se eu devia agradecer mesmo, porque isso dá um trabalho para a gente repensar nas coisas e são coisas que, quando a gente tem que falar, se tornam mais difíceis. Mas, na verdade, como eu vou comentar uns aspectos do trabalho do professor Marotti, eu gostaria de dizer que, essencialmente, o que eu vou dizer, afinal, se concentra na seguinte ideia. O século de Shakespeare é o século de confronto de duas visões que estão em disputa: a visão tradicional do poder político, a visão, eu vou dizer, medieval do poder político e dos problemas do poder político, e uma nova visão que está nascendo e da qual nós somos herdeiros. Portanto, nas peças de Shakespeare, nós vamos encontrar problemas que a gente chama hoje de Estado encarnados no príncipe. O príncipe é o Estado. Isso não é um acaso, é provavelmente o resultado desta convivência, dessa longa convivência de teorias ainda, chamemos, medievais, no tempo de Shakespeare e nas peças do Shakespeare. Então, os meus comentários, a minha exposição, tem esse eixo essencial para ser compreendida. Eu gostaria, nessa linha também, de lembrar duas coisas que eu vou comentar mais adiante, que são... Eu vou falar português. And you have no simultaneous translation? Oh. All right. Well, good. Now, I can blame on my effort to speak English all the deficiencies of the ideas. So, yeah. So what I was saying is, well, first thing is the survival of the, let's say, medieval political theories in Shakespeare's time and Shakespeare's plays in one hand, and on the other hand, the issues that appear to be issues of the prince are issues of the state. However, of course, the idea of the state is still in the process of appearing, of rising, so some of the issues have to do with that. And a third point, of course, which is part of what Professor Marotti was saying, is that let's say the confrontation between church and the prince, or the pope. At that time we would say the pope and the prince, and now we would say the church and the state. The confrontation of these two powers is widespread in Europe, and it happens everywhere. Different countries or different crowns or kingdoms will have different forms of this confrontation. We can take England as one example, but I will also mention France as another example, because there's a difference. Professor Marotti was saying that Henry of Navarra, when he was crowned, he said, Paris is worth a mass. Yeah, but then there is a legal aspect to that. In France, they had already developed, it was developing everywhere in Europe, but it was maybe a little bit more developed, more traditional, the idea that the kingdom is ruled by leges fundamentales, fundamental laws. And one of the known and accepted lex fundamentalis of the Kingdom of France was that France was the first child of the church, la fille aînée de l'Église, the first child of the church. So it was part of the fundamental laws of France that the king had to be Catholic. So what develops in France, in contrast with what was developing in England, was the king had to be Catholic, on the one hand, and he had to strive to construct an environment of tolerance. So that's why civil wars in France were long, but also the speech, the discurso on tolerance was highly developed in France. You had to develop that because the king will, if he wants to be king, will have to be Catholic on the one hand. And on the other hand, he will not kill his own subjects. That was a very strong point in the French tradition. What I'm saying is all these problems appear all over Europe, and of course in England, in Shakespeare's time, their appearance is different. So this is too long as an introduction already, so I was going to read, but now it's all in Portuguese. Let's see what I can do. Well, first thing is, I was giving my presentation or my comment a title, and the first idea was to name it The History of Sovereignty in the Century of the Reformation, which is, of course, an homage to the classical study of Jacques Leclerc, Histoire de la tolérance au siècle de la Réforme. Leclerc was studying exactly the idea of tolerance, and I would have to face the idea of sovereignty. But I think both tolerance and sovereignty develop in the siècle de la Réforme, in the century of the Reformation. My first point is that all the discussion on sovereignty cannot be understood in the 16th century without having some understanding of the previous formulation of sovereignty by late medieval legal scholars. Names specifically are Bartolo and Baldo de Ubaldis, who developed the idea of sovereignty in their own way. In the century of the Reformation, what happens is that the political structure is put to question, and different formulations of the idea of sovereignty have to develop. One of these ideas appears, and not by chance, in a treaty by a French author, Jean Bodin, on the Republic. He is writing in the period of the Reformation. He will take the tradition of the medieval scholars, legal scholars, and he will somehow reframe that tradition for his own purposes. And that's why his book, his treaty, the 6 books, the treatise de República, and written in 6 books, so the 6 books of the Republic, becomes a founding piece of modern political thought. Not always remembered. I think Hobbes later and Machiavelli a little bit previously have had important public relations, but Bodin still is very important. Of course, one would also have to add, as Professor Marotti referred before, the works of the Catholic legal or jurists and theologians. One was mentioned already, Juan de Mariana. But then, of course, there's another name one has to mention, is Cardeal Bellarmino, Roberto Bellarmino, who had a very interesting and long dispute argument with King James I. That's one interesting thing also. We have to remember that England had this king who was also a theologian, James I, who was actually, in England, it's very interesting, who was responsible for developing the idea of, or the theory of the divine power of kings. He is very important, and in that respect, he contradicts Cardeal Bellarmino's position, and this is a very important argument during that time. And then all that comes to Professor Ghirardi's book, and his book's title, The World is Out of Joint. The World is Out of Joint. O mundo está fora do prumo, o mundo está fora de esquadro. Is it really? Is it really? Yes and no, of course. And I think this is what shows in Shakespeare's plays, this combination of things that seem to be out of joint, and at the same time, there is some structure to it. So, of course, the world is out of joint because the most important power that was responsible for arbitrating disputes, this power is, in a way, let's say, under siege, and that's the Pope. He had the power that I'm sorry, you all know me, and you know this, I have this obsessive idea of the poder moderador, this power that will moderate and arbitrate conflicts with other sovereign powers, and the power of the Pope was a sort of poder moderador universal at that time, and this conception of such power is under siege. And the other power, which does not affect so much England and France, it was the power of the emperor. So in these two countries, France and England, the only actual universal power that existed was the Pope, not the emperor. They had been living, and that was part of the tradition in the works of the medieval legal scholars, was that France, England, and the Iberian Peninsula were out of the power of the emperor. They recognized that. They acknowledged that they were not subject to the emperor. So they were subject to the Pope, and in the century of the Reformation, the Pope could not arbitrate effectively these conflicts anymore. So this is a picture of the background. What I would like to stress is just to close this first point, which is the point in which we are commenting the legal and political environment of the time, is Baudin's idea of sovereignty. And his definition is, sovereignty is the absolute and perpetual power of a republic, which the Latins call majestas, the Greeks acra exousia, kurion arche e kurion politeuma, and the Italians signoria, a word they use for particular people, or particular people, and for those who exercise complete control of the state, while the Hebrews would call it tomeh shevet, that is the highest power of command. So apparently the idea that he is stressing is the idea of absolute power. However, he explains himself, absolute does not mean, and that's where the medieval tradition starts to enter. He says, absolute is not arbitrary. That is, I can do everything within my field of power, but I cannot exercise my power capriciously. And that's where he still refers to the political theory developed by late legal scholars, especially Bartolo and Baldo. And Bartolo and Baldo have a long, they make this effort, strong effort, to review all the Roman law texts that refer to the absolute power of the emperor, to interpret those texts in accordance with what we could call a proto-republican ideal, or at least an ideal of a power that can be reviewed. And of course, the texts are whatever. One is found in Digesto, in the Digest, Book 1, Title 4, Fragment 1. What pleases the king has the force of law. And the other is the prince's ableges solutus, that's Digest 1, Digest Book 1, Title 3, Fragment 13. How do you interpret that? The long tradition in medieval legal science was that those two texts had to be interpreted in accordance with two other texts that were found in the Corpus Juris Civilis. One is the well-known Digna Vox. It says, of course, the prince is not bound by the laws, but it is worthy of a king to subject himself to the laws. That makes the good king, the good prince, when he's subject to the laws. So they would restrict the interpretation of the other two texts by saying, yes, the king may not be bound by the laws, but the good king, yes, he does not act capriciously. He will only review the laws and enact new law that's very medieval whenever it's necessary. And he won't review them or enact new laws when it's not necessary. So that was a combination of acceptance of the idea of an absolute power that a king can to save the republic, to save the kingdom, or to save the people, or the multitude, as they would say. He will interfere with the laws. But that has to have a reason. And I think that still remains in Baudin's conception in many ways. And that was Digna Vox. The other text that we can find in the Digest, or in the Corpus Juris actually, is the so-called Lex Regia. That is, the idea that the emperor receives his power, or the prince receives his power from the people. That is, the Roman people passed their power to the emperor. And that's a second way you can control the capricious power of the prince. That he will act in a way, as a manager of the power. And I think that's what we still find in Baudin's idea, because he said this sovereign power belongs to the republic, actually. Of course, it's incarnated in the prince, but the power is of the republic. If that power disappears, he says, it's not the king that disappears, it's the republic that disappears. So when he's talking about that, I think he's still within or inside this long tradition of the power developed, or sovereignty, the idea of sovereignty and power developed by medieval scholars. So what happens is they will develop before Baudin this idea that, of course, the prince is ableges solutus, but as he's not capricious, as he's not arbitrary, he will enforce his own powers with some moderation. And you will have internal controls for the power and external controls for this power. The external controls, that's what is in question in the time of Shakespeare. That is, if you don't have the Pope, if you don't have the Emperor, if you don't have anybody outside who will control it, then what you will be left with is the internal control of the prince, of the powers of the prince. And I'll skip to the end, which is the second part. I find this survival of this internal control of the prince in Henry V, which is not the tyrant, at least in the play Henry V. He is not the tyrant, or he's not ambitious as Macbeth, or he's not a tyrant as Richard III, or he is actually, in a way, the model of the good prince. And in the first scene, what you find is that the Archbishop of Canterbury, if I'm not mistaken, telling one of his assistants, the king has changed so much from what he was in his youth, and now that he's king. And I think this is part of a leitmotif in the play, that he's going to be a good king as long as he abides by the tradition of the good prince. And this is all, in my opinion, it could be at least a very medieval idea of prince that you still find in Henry V. And this can be found in certain parts of the play, and I have chosen a few of them. Some of them were already mentioned by Professor Marotti. I would like to mention just a few. Of course, the first thing interesting is Act 1, Scene 1, when, in my reading, Shakespeare presents the clerics, the Archbishop of Canterbury, in a sort of ambiguous way. Because what he says is, to his public, says, the clerics and the Archbishop has second intentions. And that's the first thing that you notice about then, of course, you could develop that into the context of fight and the religious strife that has been mentioned by Professor Marotti. But then you have this idea, well, they have a second intention. Maybe they have been put to pressure by the king, but then they are acting not only on their moral instincts or moral principles, they're acting on strategic principles also. So they have to survive. So he says, well, we have to do that. But in the second scene, it's very interesting because the king is in council and he makes a warning. He gives a warning to the clerics. The clerics, it's very interesting also because the clerics are the ones, as legal scholars, and at that time in England, we have to remember, they would not teach Roman law, which was universal law, in the universities. So who were the ones who had professional knowledge of Roman law via canon law? Were the clerics. And the clerics are called to give an opinion about the rights of the king on the Kingdom of France, on the county that he could have inherited from his mother's family. And then the warning he gives the bishops is this. My learned Lord, we pray you to proceed and justly and religiously unfold why the law salique that they have in France, or should not, bar us in our claim. And God forbid, my dear and faithful Lord, that you should fashion, rest, or bow your reading, or nicely charge your understanding soul with opening titles miscreate, whose right suits not in native colors with the truth. For God, essa frase, this is an interesting sentence. For God doth know how many, now in health, shall drop their blood in approbation of what your reverence shall incite us to. Therefore take heed how you impart our person, how you awake the sleeping sword of war. We charge you, in the name of God, take heed. For never two such kingdoms did contend without much fall of blood. And then it goes on and on. So it's a warning on the old and traditional idea that, first, I think there are two ideas in this part. One is the king will not be a tyrant if he has, that's the medieval scholarship, if he has good title to the kingdom. So he has to know he has good title according to his inheritance to that part of France. first thing. And the other thing is wars have to be fought under just circumstances. You have Dieu, that's the o selo do rei da Inglaterra. Dieu est mon droit, God and my right. I will only take the sword if I have a right to do that. That's in a way very medieval. So that's the first thing in which all this tradition still appears. In a time of, let's say, upheaval, still Shakespeare does make reference to these old medieval traditional ideas of the good prince and the good sovereign. The other has been mentioned already by Professor Marotti, is the vigil of the Battle of Agincourt. And the two things is, exactly as he said, I think this is important. First, you have how people perceive the war, how they think of the war. The king walks around the camp during the night anonymously, and he hears the people. And that's very interesting because also that seems to be a good side of Henry V's character, because he wants to know what the people say about him and about the war. And of course, he will hear things that will upset his conscience. And then comes the beautiful soliloquy, you say that, in literature, on the conscience of the king. And then again, that's where very clearly what you have is the tradition of medieval control of the tyrants. And he says, things like, well, first there is the warning of the people that says, by will, he says, but if the cause be not good, the king himself hath a heavy reckoning to make when all those legs and arms and heads, chopped off in the battle, shall join together at the latter day and cry, oh, we died at such a place. Some swearing, some crying for a surgeon, some upon their wives left poor behind them. So it's a very religious idea that the conscience of the king has to be ready for the judgment day. And in the judgment day, it is his people who are going to be their promotores, accusatores. So that's an important idea. And then, of course, what Henry will offer is a long soliloquy in which he says, well, I need to have this good cause for the war, but if I do have this good cause for the war, this very legal, very, very juristic, then I'm not responsible for each one's death. See if I can find what he says. It's a sort of response to the word of the people. It says, now, if these men have defeated the law and outrun native punishment, though they can outstrip men, they have no wings to fly from God. War is his spittle, war is his vengeance, so that here men are punished for before breach of the king's laws, for before breach of the king's law in now the king's quarrel. Where they feared the death, they have borne life away. And then he goes on, and he's saying, if I have a good cause, I am not responsible for the kind of death they will take, and for the judgment they will suffer, or their souls will suffer before God. So he's not responsible for that if he has a good cause. It's also very traditional, very medieval in a way, surviving in this period of confrontation. And the last scene I would like to mention, this is very interesting too, very medieval in many ways, is his marriage, the final scene. This is Act 5, Scene 2, the queen says the following. They are blessing, the king and queen are blessing his marriage with their daughter, and they say, God, the best maker of all marriages, combine your hearts in one, your realm in one. As man and wife, being two, are one in love, so be there twixt your kingdoms such a spousal, that never may ill office or fell jealousy, which troubles oft the bed of blessed marriage, thrust in between the passion of these kingdoms, to make divorce of their incorporate league. That English may as French Englishmen receive each other. The idea of a marriage. Of course, here is the idea of a marriage between the two kingdoms, and that idea was fated to disappear in political thought. This idea still is the idea that kingdoms and peace between kingdoms can be achieved through dynastic arrangements, and this is going to disappear totally. But then the idea of marriage also is important, because there was a long tradition within legal scholarship that would use the analogy between husband and wife to say that was a relationship between the Pope and the Church in one way. Well, Christ and the Church, and the Pope as his vicar with the Church. And then also of the king and his people. There was a marriage. And in a marriage, even though the partners are not equal, they have reciprocal duties and rights. And I think this appears as a survival of this old traditional legal scholarship into Shakespeare's time. So these are just the ideas I wanted to show. I mean, we could develop that into long seminar. What I would like to point is that in the time of Shakespeare, in the century of the Reformation, all these ideas still survived. It's going to take a long time until the nation state and the state will take the place of the king or the prince, and the idea of a commonwealth, takes the place of the idea of a marriage between prince and people and between kingdoms. And that's basically what I would like to comment, just to suggest some different lines of thought on the time of Shakespeare. And as you know, I'm not a specialist in Shakespeare of the 16th century. For that matter, I've been studying the 19th century in Brazil, asking how did things work in this country in the 19th century. But, of course, it's always a challenge to read Shakespeare. And, of course, it's full of these ideas that were floating around in his time. And I thought that Henry V is a good example of the survival of these still traditional ideas. And in his kings, he's probably the one who's presented with the best figure after all. Thank you very much. Thank you.